So good morning. Like Shri said, I am Sass Linneken. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Director of Resources for Organizing and Social Change. The event planners for today's gathering asked me recently if I'd like to come to talk to you today about the importance of following the lead and centering the voices of impacted people, because it was a topic that they felt was important and essential to the work of creating a more democratic economy. I come to this task today carrying the impacts of being someone who experienced chronic homelessness for over half a decade during my adolescence and younger adulthood. Chronic poverty by American standards up until about 5 years ago when I transitioned into working class. And also as a genderqueer person with disabilities who has a transgender son with disabilities. One of my disabilities, as a side note, is a brain injury, and so when I do public speaking like this, I work best off a script, so please bear with me. I'll try not to sound like a robot as I read. When we think about economic democracy in the way that its principles are so visibly absent from our current economic model, we know that in order to create a model that does include them, we're going to need to do more than meet the needs of the people most impacted by that fact through social services. We're going to need to actively be engaging in affecting social change. A quote that I learned of just yesterday that I think sums up the importance of what I'm here to talk about comes from the social action principles that guide the work of the people who follow the Baha'i faith. And it states simply that social change is not a project that one group of people carries out for the benefit of another. Another popular quote used by many current day activists and social change groups is even more succinct, and it's nothing about us without us. These concepts are paramount to consider because we live in an imbalanced system created by a demographic of people who still hold the majority of the seats of power today. But when you consider who the core architects of our entire legal and economic framework are, But when you consider who the core architects of our entire legal and economic framework were drafted by, you see that there aren't people who were at the table who were not rich, white, violent colonizers, all of whom were men. There were no black people or other people of color. There were no indigenous people. There were no women. There were no transgender or non-binary people to speak of at the table when they drafted the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. This means that our very foundation is built, It means that our very foundation is built on a model of supremacy. And because of this, the needs of folks who weren't affluent, cisgender white men were not factored into our social framework. And before I move forward, is there anybody in the room who does not know what the term cisgender means? It's the right group of people. In case they're shy people, cisgender means that you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. And some people don't, and I'm one of those people. The historical significance of this is that all other demographics of people in this country have been dealing with various forms of oppression, violence, generational disadvantages, and social trauma, and doing so without representation in the seats of power to put a check and balance on the power that exists over them, or to steer our society in a direction that would include and center their needs along with those of the founding colonizers. Essentially, we're existing in a system that's primarily catering to only one group out of many who are sharing the same real estate. And that's why it's not enough to just include impacted people and frontline communities by inviting them into efforts developed exclusively by folks who aren't the most direly impacted. In fact, it's essential for real transformative change to occur for those who know what solutions are needed to have a seat at the table from go. It's only in this model that the real word definition of social change can manifest. And this is not just about promoting justice or equality. It's about equity and equitable representation, which is the foundation of the philosophies that anchor economic democracy. It's also about having the humility to understand that we don't know what we don't know. So inviting the most impacted people of an issue into a process or a set of goals that wasn't designed by them for whatever reason that it wasn't, isn't anywhere near as effective in achieving equity, and even more to the point, change, because they'd still lack a seat at the table to inform on their needs and what might meet them right from the start. A real-time example of this can be seen even in the event that we're attending today. Had it had more people at the organizing table who were the most deeply economically impacted by the fallout of a strictly capitalist market economy, we might have seen a little bit of a different roster of topics covered. There are a number of important, informative, and essential workshops that are scheduled today that are going to be facilitated by a plethora of extremely incredible people, all of which cover most of the nuts and bolts of what the philosophy of economic democracy is all about. But when we think about the people most disadvantaged by living in a society that doesn't value democratic principles in its economy, we can see holes where topics that address some of the most dire impacts and severe barriers to accessing a viable way to thrive financially are not represented. For instance, lack of access to affordable childcare and what a universal or co-op model might look like, or lack of access to transportation, or more specifically, public transportation, or even considerations of what it might mean to reduce corporate exploitation by demanding wage caps on CEOs who are essentially engaging in wage theft and leaving their workers to rely on social services just to access enough food to feed their families or to heat their homes. With that said, it's also true that engaging directly and severely impacted people in leadership roles can be a struggle because they're so often tapped out, particularly in this state when we think of those being impacted most by the injustice of a capitalist market economy. These folks are not only living in the constant state of burnout that grows from worrying about basic survival needs. If they're engaged in this type of work, they're often already stretched thin by repeated requests to be the face of their demographic for campaigns, events, and movements that they may have had no hand in designing, some or many of which are catering more to middle-class issues than the ones that they're grappling with every day. That truth definitely poses challenges for knowing where to start when your intention is to center those voices and follow the right leadership. And it underlines why the slow but essential work of authentic relationship building is so important in organizing and social change, and of not allowing the perceived urgency of an issue to lead us into acting without considering the effectiveness of those efforts if we aren't working alongside people who already know useful solutions because of their lived experiences. It's also why, when thinking about how to frame this conversation, I asked for community input from people impacted by social and economic injustice to weigh in on what I should talk about, because the challenges posed by both privileged folks who represent the dominant culture to organize with equity and impacted folks to find places where they'll be authentically empowered are real. Some of the feedback I got was crucial, and so I'd just like to share a small bit of that, because rather than speak to why this is so important, Most who weighed in spoke to models that will encourage a way to be successful at it, and I think that might be useful to address. So before I wrap up, I'd like to offer just a couple morsels that were suggested by people who know what they need. Probably the most salient point that was discussed was the necessity of using class consciousness when working alongside economically disadvantaged and marginalized people, by communicating with them openly about how to meet them where they're at in terms of experience. This idea underlines how critical it is to invest in the people doing the work through providing meaningful mentorship and being sure to understand, acknowledge, and address the concerns and needs that arise when a person comes to the work possibly never having had their needs or experiences centered, or never having any opportunity for leadership. Without making a deep and authentic investment, impacted folks whose skills aren't as developed as needed can be left feeling insecure and grappling with unwarranted feelings of ineptitude simply due to a lack of experience in supportive and vital mentoring. Without proper channels for growing the skills essential to lead with confidence, there's an increased risk of inadvertently causing further burnout and harm, tokenizing, and stunting the ability for personal growth. Also pointed out in that regard is that the approach in offering mentorship needs to be well informed so as not to be paternal, classist, or based on a model that is not grounded in decolonizing power structures. Doing this well takes active listening, creativity, and a willingness to do things differently, including a willingness to even rethink budgeting and how to prioritize our resources. Which is also true for thinking through the importance of compensating impacted people for their labor, which doesn't come without a cost to them, and should, as often as possible, be considered if and when capacity exists. And one final point that I wanted to pull from that feedback was the idea of considering the impact of what it means when people are picked to speak on behalf of a demographic based on the palatability of the dominant culture. One example offered was the propensity for people with a lot of resources to ask people raised and living working class or straddling working class to speak on issues focused on poverty. When, because the class distinction is real, that choice not only reduces the effectiveness of their input, it maintains a supremacy model that continues to exclude the voices of the people who are struggling the most. It also, simultaneously, caters to those who might have found it uncomfortable to hear from people hurt most by the inequity of who has resources in the room and who doesn't. And as someone who's been poor and am now working class, I can speak to the fact that being working class is far different than being poor. I may not have much, if any, discretionary income, but I do have access to resources and people with economic resources. And that fact completely changed my life. 20 or so years ago, I had my life literally ruined on multiple occasions over $200 to $300 car repairs. I couldn't pay for them, and as a result, I lost jobs when I couldn't get to them, and then places to live as a result. Whereas earlier this year, when I was in need of money to fix my car and have the dentures repair that I need due to inadequate dental care in my youth, a friend of mine was able to raise over $1,000 for me in less than 3 days by sending out a fundraiser to a community of people who know me. It was a pretty bittersweet experience. It was a beautiful, gratitude-filled experience, and one where I could look back at my younger self and think, wow, my life could have just not been ruined if I knew the right people. You don't know what you don't know. The distinction is real, but the overarching point here is that it's not only important to follow the leadership and center the voices of the people we think are most impacted, it's also important to always be challenging our own biases and asking ourselves if the people who truly are being the most impacted by the issues that we're working on are at the table, and to consider the risks that we run if they're not, since it's the only real way to achieve social change that can shift us into a more democratic model. So, in closing, I just want to say that I really appreciate the opportunity that the planning team gave me to speak about this subject today, and for putting this on at all, and for all of you for being willing to listen to me while I read. I'm talking about this mostly from my own vantage point, but I'm certainly no more an expert than anybody else who has dealt with the inequities in society. And I'm still definitely on a learning curve when it comes to doing my work in the most equitable and just ways possible. For instance, I don't know that I've ever put a whole lot of thought into directly asking about the needs for specific mentoring of people that I'm working with, though I should have, because it's been something I've experienced myself. After hearing that suggestion, it seemed really obvious to me, and it's about certain that it will always be something on my mind and to the best of my ability in my practice moving forward. So, thank you for listening.